Hello, and welcome to Bees of the Northeast, part of North Branch Nature Center's online Nature Now series. I'm Spencer, and I'm the project coordinator for a wild bee survey run by the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and I'm going to be with you for the next couple months talking about the wonderful world of bees and the incredible diversity of natural histories that exist within the state of Vermont. And this should be broadly applicable throughout much of the Northeast. I'm going to jump right in because I've got a lot to cover today. So this class is split into 4 units. The first unit I've split into 2 parts because it's a lot of material. This video is going to be Bee Watching 101, a broad overview of everything bees. Part 2 of Unit 1 is going to be an overview of the roughly 37 genera of bees known from Vermont. Especially Part 2 of Unit 1 can be watched at any time, and I encourage you to come back to it throughout the course. It's going to be a lot, pretty overwhelming at first, but I want to get it out there so that as you see these different bees this summer, you can start to get a sense of where they all fall. Unit 2 is going to be on bumblebees, which are most people's favorite, these fuzzy bees like this one in the photo. Unit 3 is going to be on my favorite, kleptoparasites, parasitoids, and all the other things that like to eat bees. And Unit 4 is going to be on pollen specialists and bee conservation in general. So I'm going to jump into Unit 1 here with a quick game. Each of these slides, the 2 photos, one of them is a bee, one of them is a knot. You can write these down if you want, or just do it in your head. I may circle back to this at the end of the class and test to see how well how much you've learned. This is Avis mellifera, the western honeybee, and on the right is a dronefly. This is a bumblebee and another species of dronefly. On the left is a beetle, intentionally a bee mimic beetle. And I include a beetle here because on flowers they don't show their wings and they're not as bee-like. But when they're flying between flowers, I often get confused and swing at beetles with my net, and I'm surprised that I end up with a beetle and not a bee. And this is the ligated furrow bee, Halictus, on the right. This one's a trick question. Both of these are droneflies. These are in fact the same species. On the left was taken here in Vermont, and on the right was taken in California. Just showing that these bee mimics often mimic the specific bee species that are found in that area. In the west, there's several species with these black abdomens with white or yellow tips. In the east, there's 2 species that have this red with yellow on either side on the abdomen. Kind of cool. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about bumblebees next unit. Getting a little harder here, moving away from traditional concepts of bees. This is Nomata, and I think it's a false horn fly. On the left is a cuckoo wasp. On the right is one of the Agolchlorini, the green sweat bees. It's a tricky one. Another Nomata on the left. On the right is an aphid wasp. One thing I found helpful in distinguishing wasps from bees, the placement of the antenna. You see how on the bee here, they're coming out above the center of the face and they're going up. On the wasp, they're slightly below the center and they're going down. Often the wasps are moving them rapidly back and forth to sense for various prey, most likely. You rarely see that in the bees. It's not foolproof, but it's helpful. That hint should help here. Hylaeus is the bee, and then the wasp is, I think, a carabinoid. Another example of the antenna pointing up on the bee and not on the wasp. This is a Anthidium and a sand wasp. Caliopsis is the genus of bee, very small, and then a bee wolf, which is a wasp that is a predator of bees. All right, You may be pretty confused by now. That's totally understandable. I'm still getting used to what is a bee and what is a wasp and what are these other things. I still get confused all the time. Um, so backing up a little bit, bees are obviously insects. They're in the order Hymenoptera with ants and sawflies and a bunch of other things. They're their own epifamily consisting of these 7 families, 6 of which are found in North America, the top 6. All 6 have representatives in Vermont and in the Northeast, except for the last one, which is only found in Australia, I believe. And then on the left here is Apis mellifera, western honeybee. This is the bee that most people are familiar with, and when I say I study bees, I almost inevitably get a question about honeybees. Um, for this class and in general, I tend to ignore honeybees. They're basically the chickens of the bee world. They're cultivated, at least in Vermont, there's next to no wildly reproducing honeybees. They're all in someone's backyard in a honeybee hive. They do a great service, pollination of a lot of crops. They produce honey, which I love. There's some conservation issues associated with them that I'll talk about later on. But this class, I'm going to focus on the wild bees, not necessarily native. There's plenty of other non-native bees, but I'm distinguishing honeybees here as a cultivated organism and a pretty distinct genus that has some differences from any of the native North American bees. All bees, unlike any of the other wasps or other insects in this order, have branched hairs somewhere on their body. So these are hairs that have branches in them, almost like a feather. Oftentimes the branches are microscopic. Sometimes even the hairs themselves are microscopic. But if you look hard enough, you can find them on any bee. And they're used to carry pollen, which is the important difference, is that bees feed their young pollen, whereas wasps and many of these other organisms feed other protein sources such as insects or even carrion to their offspring. And that's why bees are such good pollinators. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on bee morphology. I'll touch on it where I need to as we go through. But just to get a sense of things, obviously they're insects. You've got a head, thorax, abdomen, one wing, the forewing, and then the second wing, it's hard to see in this picture, but is here. This is the hind wing. Details of the wing venation, so these black lines through the wing are important for identification of a lot of these groups. Not always visible in photos, but a good thing to get pictures of if you can. And then here the abdomen is divided into 6 segments on a female. There's a 7th segment on a male. They're called terga on the top, sternite on the bottom. And on the face, we've got the important thing here to look at is the clypeus, this trapezoidal shape. It's helpful for identification of some bees. Other features, you've got the mandibles, and then this is called the labrum in the center. The compound eyes, these are the main eyes, but then there's these 3, hard to see in this photo, but there's 3 simple eyes called ocelli on the top of the head of all bees. These are used primarily for sensing light and dark. You'll see them scattered throughout this presentation. Antenna, males have 13 antenna segments, females have 12. Again, not something you're likely to see up close, but something to be aware of. And as I go through here, unfortunately, I'm going to have to use a fair number of Latin names. This will be confusing at first, and my pronunciation is going to be awful for some of them. So bear with me. I do encourage you to try and at least learn the Latin names for the common genera. Many bee species don't have English names, so it's not really an option for a lot of these groups. I'll use them when they exist and when they're standardized, but I've also seen a lot of common names appear on places like iNaturalist that are not well accepted in the literature and can get confusing. The example at the bottom here just illustrates that point, that these 2 bees are both minor bees, is the common name, but they're in totally different genera. And the the 8-spotted minor bee is in the genus Perdita, which are commonly known as fairy bees. But the eastern minor bee is in the genus Coleopsis, which have a different common name. So I'm going to stay away from them unless they're relatively standardized. Um, all right, so you want to find some bees. I assume that's why you're taking this class. Uh, there's bees everywhere, and you can find them just about anywhere you look. The exception being closed forests after about late May. Um, but assuming there's a little bit of sunshine and flowers are helpful, but not even necessary, you can find bees. This is kind of ideal bee habitat, at least for rarities and for diversity. These are the kind of places I seek out when I'm doing surveys around the state. Note the bare ground here. This is really helpful for nesting species. Lots of small forbs, weedy things that have flowers and a diversity of flowers. And then in the back here, this is a sand pit. So this is telling me that the local soil is sandy, which if you've ever tried to um, dig at the beach, you know it's a lot easier than digging through clay or rock or gravel. And the bees have the same experience. There's a bunch of species that are attracted to sand for nesting and are really only found in areas of deep sand. Um, since Vermont is a landlocked state, it's a little surprising that there's any sand here, but if you know where to look and if you once you start paying attention, you'll find sand in a lot of parts of the state, often along rivers. The bigger the river, the more likely there is to be a large area of sand and then these sand associated bees. Um, but there's sand mines along a lot of the major rivers throughout the state, and areas adjacent to these sand mines are often the same soil type and likely to have cool bees. But like I said, there's bees everywhere, even in potentially unexpected places. Top right here is basswood, a tree that's about to start flowering in the next couple weeks, and a great source of pollen and nectar for a lot of bees, um, but not something you necessarily associate with bees. On the left is a non-native daisy that's blooming right now that I've had good luck finding a lot of uh, uncommon and rare species on. It's a simple composite, which makes it easy for non-specialist bees to access. A lot of the parasitic bees, which are not necessarily pollen specialists, um, will use these simple composites like this. It's a good place to start. Sunflowers, anything in that family, goldenrod later on in the season, are all great bee flowers. Um, so finding bees is more than just finding flowers. Sometimes you find only there's certain species that are much easier to find at their nest sites. This is a prime example of that. This is the unequal cellophane bee, Cleides uniqualis. Um, it's gone for the season now in the Northeast, but come next April, it'll start these anthills, anthill-like things will start appearing in greens and baseball fields, soccer fields, anywhere there's short grass and bare ground. Um, you'll get these huge nesting aggregations of these bees with a single female guarding each hole. And there's plenty of other ground nesting bees that make these similar ant hills throughout the season. So something to keep an eye out for. Go find an old park nearby where there's trampled ground, and you might very well find bees nesting there. Uh, there's also a group of bees that nest in, or several groups of bees that nest in rotten logs. Another fun place to look, as along with bee hotels and other cavity nesting species, which I'll touch on later. Once you find a bee, for this class, ideally you're going to try and photograph it. And there's a lot of ways to go about this. Um, it's not always easy, but with practice, it's very doable. The vast majority of photos in this presentation and all my others will be the ones that I've taken with a smartphone. So on the left is a bee on a flower. This is the simplest option. Approach slowly, get your camera 6, 8, 10 inches away from the bee. Take a bunch of pictures so you get the right angle, and then you can choose the best later. Light's important, just like any photography. And I have found the close focus to be kind of frustrating on smartphones. And the solution to that is a macro lens. I have one that clips into my phone case, but there's a bunch of options of magnetic lenses that are relatively cheap and can be attached to most any camera, any smartphone camera, and allow you to focus much closer and to capture detail that you won't see otherwise. Certainly not a requirement, but a good option if this is something that you think you might get interested in. Um, Another photography option is to get to the bee in a glass vial. This is easiest to do with a net, but also can be done just by moving slowly, getting close to the bee, putting the vial underneath the bee and dropping it in, and then screwing the lid on to hold the bee. Takes some practice, but if you move slowly, it's very doable. And then in this case, I just took the lid off and carefully slid my phone over the opening of the vial. The focal length was about right, and I got a picture of the bee at the bottom of the vial. Quick and dirty, takes a little bit of practice, but a good option. And then the third option, if you want nicer pictures, take the bee in the vial, put it in the fridge for 5 or 10 minutes, or even in the freezer for a few minutes, and that'll immediately slow the metabolism down. These are cold-blooded animals. They don't do much when it's cold, below 40 or 50 degrees. And so take it out of the fridge once it's cooled down, dump it onto a nice background, and then you've got a minute or two as it warms up before it flies off. This is a great way to get extended observation and nice photos of many of these bees. A couple other less traditional photography options. If you can be certain that it's a male bee, you can just grab them, pick them up off the flower, hold them gently with the legs, take a couple pictures, and then let them go. They'll be unharmed. Obviously, you need to know that it's a male, which is not entirely straightforward. Females will sting you, although many of the smaller species, their stings are not strong enough to go through your skin. So this is a safe option for the small Lasioglossum and even some Andrena. But females will definitely sting you if you grab them, if they can. And then if I'm really moving fast and just want a quick snap to document a species presence, I'll swing a net out. I'll catch it in a net, and then as I'm releasing it, I'll start my camera phone recording a video, get the bee flying out in the video, stop it, and then when I come home, I'll go through the video and I'll find the shot that has the diagnostic features that I need, take a screenshot of that, and then there's my photo for iNaturalist or whatever. This is great for common species that I'm relatively confident of the identification on beforehand. It's an option, certainly not necessary. Catching bees, obviously easier with a net, but like I said, can be done with just a vial or your hands. The net that I use, I think it's $16 from BioQuip. It's their student net. It's a simple wooden stick and a metal loop and then the bag. Highly recommended if you're interested in this kind of thing, but this class can certainly be done without it and be just as enjoyable. Netting is a skill that takes some practice. It's not rocket science, but there's some important things to remember. Bees are skittish. If you move quickly, they'll fly off. So I like to get the net, I don't know, a foot away from my target before I start swinging, move it slowly, and then just to catch it, it's a little flip of the wrist, and I flip the bag of the net around so that it's folded along the rim of the net, which traps the bee. Bees and most other insects will have a strong tendency to fly upward when they're trapped. So in this case, in this picture here, you could even just put the net over the flower that has a bee in it, and the bee will fly up towards the top of the net, at which point you can fold the net over and trap the bee. And then you got to get it out into a vial for photography or observation. But nets are great for a lot of the fast genera that you are not likely to be able to sneak up on. There's a few groups that I've been unable to get photos with my phone without catching them. And you'll see that as we go through video 2. So for the project that I'm working on, we have been collecting a lot of bees because for many groups, it's really the only way to identify them to species, and even in some cases, you need to collect them to identify them to genus. Um, and there's several papers that have shown that collecting on this scale is not detrimental to local populations and diversity. Certainly not something you want to do in mass, but I figure I kill more bees driving to the field site with my car than I do actually doing field work. If you want to do some collection for this class, especially if you're in Vermont, feel free to reach out to me. I can help you get set up, and I would be interested to see and identify any bees you collect, at least within Vermont. But collecting is a great way to really study bees and to learn species identification as best you can. Although that also requires a microscope, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So, traditional way of identifying bees: collect them, you pin them, they're dead, and you put them under a microscope and you work through these keys. This is the Discover Life key, um, and it's minute details of hair and body shape and all kinds of things that are really only visible under a microscope. And in this key, unlike a dichotomous key that many people are familiar with, you have lots of options and you don't necessarily have to choose any one option. This key is for the genus Andrena. So if I saw that corner, that would eliminate a bunch of species and I'd be down to about 114 possible Andrena species. This is for the whole Northeast. And then I'd move on to the next feature, which is this triangle on the back of the thorax. And again, these are really subjective, difficult features to see without a lot of experience. But the more bees you look at, the more you start to see these things. And if I didn't know, or I couldn't be certain which one it was, I could select multiple options, or I could not select any of them. And then you search, and you get a new set of criteria, and you whittle your way down, and hopefully you end up with one species that matches everything. Doesn't always work like that, though. But for this class, I'm going to focus entirely on features that can be seen with good photos or even the naked eye, and trying to get uh, identification down to the genus level in most cases, although not necessarily. And there's plenty of species that can be identified to the species level, and we'll focus on those. There's four things here that I've identified as important things to look at when you first see a bee and don't know where to start. The size, the location of pollen, if there is any, uh, whether or not the bee's hairy, and then what color the body itself is. Not necessarily the hair color, but the color of the body. And then most, although not all of the bees you're going to see are going to fall into one of these 5 categories. So not including bumblebees. They're their own category for next week. There's a lot of these tiny black bees. These things are the size of a grain of rice or smaller. They're ubiquitous. They're very speciose, hard to identify. Um, they're worth paying attention to, but maybe not spending a lot of time on unless you really want to dive into these groups. You're also going to see a lot of these medium bees, sort of slightly smaller than a honeybee, bright white hair bands on the abdomen. There's bees from 3 different genera that fall into this category. And distinguishing between, especially between the furrow bees and the subgenus Lasioglossum, is tough, but I'll talk about that in a second. These are a lot of the common bees that you're going to see, especially midsummer, are going to be in this group. You're also certainly going to see some of these shiny green bees, genus Agapostemon, and then these 3 genera, each with 1 species in Vermont, that collectively are the tribe Agochlorinae, and are often just identified to that level, but all green bees. And then there's some blue bees. The Osmia are mostly done flying for the season. They're spring bees. And then the Ceratina, again, are either metallic blue or black, depending on the light. And these are ubiquitous bees that you'll see throughout the season on a lot of different flowers. And then there's a bunch of red bees that are mostly Nomata and Sphacoides, the blood bees. Both are kleptoparasitic genera that I'll talk about in a second. So size of bees, all relative. There's no need, unless you're getting deep into the weeds, you don't necessarily need to measure anything, but they range from like 3 or 4 millimeters up to queen bumblebees, which, I don't know, several centimeters. If you're familiar with jewelweed, this is a bee that fits inside the mouth of a jewelweed flower. A lot of bees are going to be in this middle range, grain of rice, slightly larger maybe, and then you've got your queen bumblebees and the large carpenter bee, which are sort of thumb sized. Perhaps the most important thing to notice on a bee when you're first observing a species or an individual is to figure out if it has any pollen, and if so, where. Um, Only females of non-parasitic species collect pollen. The males are not doing much work, and then the parasitic species are taking advantage of the work done by non-parasitic species, and their offspring are developing on the pollen that their hosts are collecting. So right there, if you see pollen on a bee, if you see pollen that's stored on a bee, sometimes you'll see pollen, like in this picture, there's a lot of pollen on the body itself, but the pollen here on the legs where it's been intentionally placed tells me that's a female of a non-parasitic species. These are all examples of pollen. These are bumblebees and honeybees add nectar to their pollen, so it ends up being like a wet, slightly stickier, um, coagulated mess off on the tibia of the hind legs, like this. This one's fallen off. These pollen balls. Andrena and a lot of other bees don't add nectar to their pollen, so you can almost see the individual grains. You get it, and they stick it on their hind legs. They've got a place for it on the back of their thorax, and then the most distinctive are the family Megachilid. The whole family of at least the non-parasitic ones put pollen on the underside of their abdomen, and they have specialized hairs there for it, which you'll see if there wasn't pollen here, and you'll see later on in the presentation. So that immediately tells you it's in the family Megachilidae. And then, of course, there's exceptions to the rule. This is Hylaeus. It's a female, but she doesn't have any pollen because they carry their pollen internally. I believe that's the only genus that does that, at least in North America. They're tiny. You'll see them, but more often than not, you'll pass them off as a wasp or a gnat, in part because they don't have pollen on them, and they don't have obvious hairs. Speaking of hairs, noticing where and what form the hair is a great place to start when you're looking at a bee. It varies from these thickly matted, tiny, short hairs on the abdomen of this Epiolus, or these like long, decorative hairs on the front leg of a male Megachilid. Knowing the difference between hair, this white band, and then this red color, which is actually the body itself, the integument. That's important for some of these groups. There's a lot of species that have red and yellow and sometimes even white body itself, as opposed to the hair, which is doing the coloring. Here, the hair is orangish, and that's where it's getting its coloring, and the body underneath is black. The front tibia, the body, is white. And then a minute ago, I mentioned the difference between Lasioglossum and Halictus. These are two really abundant genera that at least some Lasioglossum are superficially very similar to Halictus, both in the family Halictidae, the sweat bees. But the difference is that the Halictus have hair bands on both the bottom of the abdominal segment and the top of the neck segment that fuse together, overlap in the middle. Whereas Lasioglossum, you only get the hair bands on the top of the segment and not on the bottom of the segment. So at a glance, they look very similar. They're striped white stripes on black, but that's the difference there. And not necessarily something that's super obvious, but something to pay attention to if you can. And then there's a great diversity of colors: bright green, red, yellow, black. Majority of them are going to be black bodied, not all. This is the one Lasioglossum that has a yellow body with yellow hairs. It's a quite distinctive species. And then you've got the red Nomata and Kleptoparasites, other Kleptoparasites. Yeah, and take a break and join me for video 2, where I'll go through all the different genera.